The conference room had gone quiet when everyone senses something is about to happen, and nobody wants to be the one who flinches first. "I think," Gavin said, setting his tablet down on the glass table with a small, deliberate click, "it's time we talked honestly about Nora's performance." 14 people sat around that table. Senior directors. 2 board observers visiting from New York. The head of HR, who suddenly found her coffee cup very interesting. And me, sitting exactly where I always sat, third chair from the end, notebook open, pen uncapped, like any other Tuesday morning strategy review. Honestly, I repeated, and I heard how flat my own voice sounded. "The Meridian account restructure," Gavin said, turning to face the room instead of me, which told me everything about who this was really for. "The Holbrook renegotiation. The Q3 forecasting error that nearly cost us the Pierce contract. I've been patient. I've given Nora every opportunity to course correct. But at some point, patience becomes enabling." Someone at the far end of the table shifted in their chair. Diane Foster, our CFO, did not look up from her folder. I could have said the truth right there. I could have reminded everyone in that room that I was the one who caught the Q3 forecasting error, not caused it, that I'd flagged it in an email at 11:40 on a Thursday night. An email Gavin had forwarded to the board the next morning under his own name with 2 sentences changed. I could have reminded them that the Holbrook renegotiation succeeded because I'd spent 3 weekends rebuilding the risk model from scratch after his version fell apart in front of the client. I didn't say any of it. So, Gavin continued, and I watched him enjoy this, watched the corner of his mouth do the thing it did when he thought he'd already won. "Effective today, we're ending your role here. HR will walk you through the details. I want to thank you for your years of service, and I wish you well." 14 faces. Some wouldn't meet my eyes. One woman, Priya, gripped her pen so hard I thought it might snap. Marcus, 2 seats down, looked almost sorry, which was its own kind of interesting, given what I already knew about Marcus. I closed my notebook. I kept my pen. I stood up, smoothed my blazer, and I did something that made Gavin's smile falter for just a fraction of a second, so brief that if you weren't watching for it, you'd have missed it entirely. I smiled back. "Thank you, Gavin," I said, "for making this so easy." Then I picked up my bag and walked out, and I did not look back, because I didn't need to. I already knew exactly what was going to happen next, and it wasn't what anyone in that room believed. 3 years earlier, I hadn't known Gavin Whitmore's name at all. I was 31, living in a rental apartment 2 train stops from the Ashford Meridian headquarters, going by the name Nora Bennett, my mother's maiden name, and carrying a resume that listed a decade of strategy consulting experience under that name, all of it real, all of it earned somewhere else, far from Chicago, far from anyone who'd recognize me. My actual name is Nora Ashford. My father was Daniel Ashford, and 26 years earlier he'd built a small structural engineering consultancy into what eventually became Ashford Meridian Group, an infrastructure and renewable energy investment firm with offices in 4 cities and a client list that included half the utility companies in the Midwest. He died 6 years before I walked into that building as Nora Bennett. "Heart attack," the coroner said. I've never fully believed that was the whole story, and I'll get to why. What matters is this: my father left behind a company, a board that had grown comfortable, and a trust, the Ashford Family Trust, that held 61% of the voting shares in his company. I was the sole beneficiary. I had been since I was 25. But the trust had a condition my father wrote into it himself, in his own handwriting, in a private letter my mother didn't show me until I turned 30. He wrote, "Don't take the company because it's yours. Earn the right to know it first. Go in as no one and see who the good people are when they think no one important is watching." I thought it was sentimental when I first read it. I understood it completely by the time I'd worked there 6 months. I applied for a mid-level strategy role under my mother's name, using a professional history that was entirely true, but attached to nothing that would connect me to Daniel Ashford. Nobody at Ashford Meridian, aside from 3 people, knew who I really was. Walter Higgins, my father's old business partner and the retired chief operating officer, who still sat on the board and had known me since I was in diapers. Elliot Voss, the general counsel, who managed the technical administration of the trust and had a legal obligation to know. And my mother, who thought the entire plan was reckless and told me so at least once a month. I got hired into the corporate strategy division. My direct supervisor was a man named Gavin Whitmore. I liked him at first. That's the part people never want to hear in stories like this, but it's the truth, and the truth matters more than the version that makes me look smarter than I was. Gavin was 38, sharp, funny in meetings, the kind of person who remembered your coffee order and asked about your weekend and actually seemed to listen to the answer. He'd been at the company 9 years, had climbed from analyst to VP of corporate strategy through what looked, on the surface, like genuine talent and hard work. He took me under his wing almost immediately. "You've got good instincts, Bennett," he told me during my second month, after I'd caught an inconsistency in a vendor contract that would have cost us $400,000. "Stick with me and you'll go places." I believed him. That's the part that still stings a little, even now. The first time he took credit for something of mine, I told myself it was a misunderstanding. It was a market entry proposal for expanding our renewable energy division into 2 new states. I'd built the entire financial model myself, stayed late for 11 straight nights modeling regulatory risk across 4 different scenarios. Gavin presented it to the executive committee. He used my slides. He used my numbers. He used, almost word for word, 3 phrases I'd written in my summary memo. He never once said my name. Afterward, in the hallway, he clapped me on the shoulder. "Great work in there," he said, like I'd been in the room, like I'd had any part in the applause that followed. This is exactly the kind of thing that gets people promoted. Except it got him promoted. 6 weeks later, he was made senior VP. I didn't say anything. I told myself there would be a next time, a bigger project, a clearer moment, and when it came, I'd say something then. I told myself I needed to understand the company better before I made noise. I told myself a dozen things, and some of them were even true, but underneath all of it was something simpler. I was there to learn who Ashford Meridian really was underneath its polished quarterly reports. And Gavin Whitmore had just become the most useful window into that truth I could have asked for. Because here's the thing about people who steal credit. Once you understand that they will always choose their own advancement over honesty, you start to see the shape of what else they might be willing to do. The second incident was worse, and it's the one that made me start paying real attention. We had a major client, Pierce Utilities, threatening to walk after a service failure that wasn't even our division's fault. Gavin panicked in the client call. I watched him fumble the numbers, contradict himself twice, and nearly lose an $11 million contract in real time. I sent him a message midway through the call, a private chat, 3 lines with the actual fix. He read it off almost verbatim, closed the deal, and thanked the client for understanding our commitment to precision. Afterward, he found me at my desk. "Good catch back there," he said, and for 1 second I thought he might actually acknowledge it properly. "You should thank Nora," said Priya, who'd been sitting close enough to see the whole exchange. Priya Nair was an analyst 2 years into her career, quiet, meticulous, one of the only people in that office who seemed to actually notice things. Gavin laughed, a little too quickly. "Teamwork," he said, and moved on. That night Priya found me in the break room. "You know he does this constantly, right?" she said. "I've watched him do it to 3 different people since I started. He's good at it because he never makes it obvious. It's never one big theft. It's 100 small ones." "I know," I told her. "Then why don't you say something?" I didn't have an answer for her that I could give honestly, so I told her a half-truth instead. "I'm figuring some things out first." She looked at me a long moment, like she wanted to ask more, then didn't. That was the beginning of something between us, not quite friendship yet, but the start of trust, which in that building was worth more. It was around that time I found the first real irregularity, and it had nothing to do with Gavin stealing credit for my ideas. It was bigger and stranger, and it started with an asset valuation report that didn't add up. Ashford Meridian owned a mid-sized subsidiary called Colby Renewables, a wind energy development arm my father had personally built 15 years earlier. As part of a routine strategy review, I pulled the internal valuation figures to model a potential expansion. The number in our internal system was 40% lower than the number I calculated using our own standard methodology, applied to our own numbers. 40%. On a subsidiary worth, by my calculation, nearly $200 million. I assumed it was a modeling error at first. I ran it 3 more times. Same result. I pulled the historical valuations going back 4 years and found the discrepancy had been growing steadily, quietly, one adjustment at a time, always small enough that nobody auditing a single year would notice, but large enough, compounded, that it painted a very different picture of what Colby Renewables was actually worth. Someone was making the subsidiary look less valuable than it was. And I could only think of 2 reasons anybody does that. Either to reduce a tax burden, which our filings didn't support, or to make a company look cheap enough, right before someone tries to buy it. I didn't tell Gavin. I didn't tell anyone in strategy. Instead, I went to the one person at Ashford Meridian I could trust completely with the truth of who I was. Walter Higgins met me for coffee 2 blocks from the office, at a place he chose specifically because nobody from work ever went there. He was 71, silver-haired, still sharp enough to make junior board members nervous, and the only person left in the company who'd known my father before he was anybody. "Your dad used to say the same thing about Colby," Walter told me, stirring his coffee slowly. "Said it was the crown jewel nobody else could see yet. If someone's quietly shrinking its value on paper, Nora, that's not an accounting choice. That's a setup." A setup for what? For someone to buy it cheap. Or use a low valuation to justify selling it off entirely, dress it up as a strategic divestment, and pocket the difference somewhere nobody's looking too closely. He set his cup down. "You need to find out who's authorizing those adjustments." "I have an idea," I said. "But I need proof before I say the name out loud, even to you." Walter studied me the way he used to when I was 9 years old and had clearly broken something in my father's study and was trying to talk my way out of it. "Your father wrote that letter for a reason, you know. He wanted you to see the company the way he never let himself see it near the end. Clear-eyed. Don't let sentiment slow you down. But don't let it turn you cold, either. That's not what he'd want." I didn't fully understand what he meant by near the end that day. I would, eventually. That was its own thread, one I hadn't started pulling yet. The valuation adjustments led back to a signature I recognized immediately because I saw it on financial reports every week. Diane Foster, our Chief Financial Officer. That surprised me less than it probably should have. Diane had always kept a careful distance from me, polite but cool, the kind of colleague who answered your questions in the fewest words possible and never lingered in a conversation a second longer than necessary. I'd assumed it was simply her personality. Now I wondered if it was something else. But a signature authorizing a valuation adjustment wasn't proof of wrongdoing on its own. CFOs adjust valuations constantly for entirely legitimate reasons. I needed to understand why, and I needed to understand whether Gavin was involved, or whether this was something happening entirely above his head, something he might not even know about. I decided to test it. In our next strategy meeting, I mentioned, casually, almost offhandedly, that I'd been looking at expansion opportunities for Colby Renewables, and that I thought its true value was significantly underrepresented in our internal models. Gavin's reaction told me everything. He didn't argue with the substance. He didn't ask a single question about my methodology, which wasn't like him. Gavin loved picking apart methodology, loved showing off how carefully he checked everyone's work before he took credit for it. Instead, he changed the subject within 30 seconds, redirected the meeting toward the Pierce account, and afterward, in the hallway, he found a moment to speak to me privately. I'd steer clear of the Colby numbers if I were you, he said, friendly, easy, like he was doing me a favor. There's a lot of sensitivity around that file right now. Above our pay grade. Focus on what you're good at. Above our pay grade. That was the first time Gavin Whitmore ever lied to my face, and I recognized it instantly, because I finally understood what I was looking at. He wasn't the architect of whatever was happening with Colby Renewables. He was being kept informed of it, which meant someone above him, someone with real authority, trusted him enough to let him know to stay away from it. Which meant Gavin was more valuable to whoever was really running this than his job title suggested. And that meant the person underestimating Gavin Whitmore's ambition was almost certainly the person orchestrating this. I started keeping a folder. Not on the company servers, a private one, encrypted, backed up somewhere no one at Ashford Meridian would ever think to look. Every valuation discrepancy. Every meeting where Gavin deflected. Every email where Diane's language felt just slightly too careful. It wasn't enough yet. But it was a beginning. 6 months into that quiet collection of evidence, Priya came to my desk on a Friday afternoon with her laptop tucked against her chest like she was carrying something fragile. I need to show you something, she said, and I need you to not ask how I got it. She'd found a draft memo, saved in a shared folder Gavin had apparently forgotten to lock down properly, outlining a strategic realignment of the corporate strategy division. Buried in bureaucratic language was a plan to eliminate 2 positions within the next 2 quarters, restructure reporting lines so that Gavin answered directly to the board rather than through the standard executive chain, and this was the part that made my stomach turn cold, a performance improvement plan already drafted for an employee identified only as MV. That's you, Priya said quietly. He's already writing the paperwork to get rid of you. Before you've even done anything wrong. I read it twice. It was dated 8 weeks earlier. Which meant Gavin had decided I was a threat to be removed long before I'd ever mentioned Colby Renewables in a meeting. Why would he target you? Priya asked. You've never even pushed back on him publicly. You let him take the credit every time. It was a fair question, and for the first time, I gave her something close to the full truth. Because I think he's noticed I ask better questions than he's comfortable with. And I think someone above him has noticed the same thing and told him to handle it. Priya sat down slowly in the chair across from my desk. Nora, who are you really? I looked at her for a long moment. Somewhere in that stretch of silence, I made a decision I'd been circling for months. Someone who's going to need people she can trust very soon. Can I trust you? Yes, she said, without hesitation, and something about the speed of her answer, no performance in it at all, told me I'd read her correctly from the beginning. I didn't tell her everything that day, but I told her enough. Enough that when everything came apart later, she wouldn't be blindsided, and enough that she understood the stakes were bigger than one unfair performance review. Not everyone I trusted deserved it. Marcus Bell had joined the strategy team 4 months after me, transferred in from the business development side with an easy laugh and an apparent talent for making everyone feel like his closest colleague. I liked him. I made the mistake of telling him more than I should have, early on, about my suspicions regarding the Colby valuations, nothing about who I really was, but enough about what I'd found. I noticed the change in Gavin's behavior almost immediately after that conversation. A pointed comment in a meeting that echoed something I'd only said to Marcus. A question from Diane Foster's office, delivered through an assistant, that referenced a specific figure I'd only discussed with him. I didn't confront Marcus. Instead, I started testing him, the way I'd tested Gavin. I fed him small pieces of false information, harmless details that couldn't hurt anyone, and watched to see if they resurfaced somewhere they shouldn't. They did. Every time. It hurt more than I expected it to. Not because Marcus mattered to me the way Priya had come to matter, but because it confirmed something uglier than simple office politics. Someone was actively watching me, through him, and had been for months. Marcus wasn't a bystander who occasionally repeated things carelessly. He was a source. Whether Gavin was paying him, or promising him something, or simply using whatever leverage people like Gavin always seem to find, I didn't know yet. But I understood, finally and completely, that I wasn't just watching a company with a credit-stealing manager problem. I was watching a much larger structure protect itself. And it had started watching me back. The midpoint came on an ordinary Wednesday, in the least dramatic way possible, which is often how the truth actually arrives, not in a thunderclap, but in a spreadsheet. Elliot Voss called me into his office. I'd always found Elliot difficult to read, precise, guarded, the kind of lawyer who answered questions with more questions, and I genuinely wondered, more than once, whether he was protecting the trust or protecting himself. That day, he closed his door, lowered the blinds, and slid a printed document across his desk without a word. It was a term sheet. A preliminary acquisition proposal from Holbrook Industrial, a much larger competitor, to purchase Colby Renewables outright at a valuation almost exactly matching the artificially depressed number in our internal system. Attached to it was an internal routing history showing the document had passed through Diane Foster's office and Gavin Whitmore's office and had been scheduled for board presentation in 11 weeks, under a category that would allow it to bypass a full shareholder vote, provided the board itself approved it unanimously first. Your father built Colby from nothing, Elliot said quietly. If this goes through at this valuation, the trust loses roughly $130 million in equity value overnight, and Ashford Meridian loses its most promising growth division to a direct competitor. I have a fiduciary obligation to you as trust beneficiary that supersedes my obligation to this company's day-to-day management, and I am telling you, formally, right now, this needs to be stopped. And you are the only person with the authority to stop it. Why no? I asked. Why show me this now? Elliot leaned back. Because I've watched Gavin building a case against you for months, and I think it's connected. I think someone realized you were getting close to the truth about Colby and decided the fastest way to eliminate the risk was to eliminate you, as an employee, before anyone ever had to acknowledge what you actually are. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I asked the question I'd been circling for months without letting myself say it out loud. Do you think this goes back to my father? Do you think this is why he died? Elliot didn't answer right away, which was itself an answer. I think your father discovered something about the valuations 6 years ago. I think it caused him enormous stress in the final months of his life. I don't have proof of anything beyond that, and I want to be careful not to hand you a conspiracy I can't back with facts. But I don't think it's a coincidence, Nora. I never have. I left his office that day carrying something heavier than evidence. I was carrying the possibility that this had never just been about credit or office politics or even $130 million. It might have been, in some indirect way I still couldn't fully prove, about my father's life. That was the moment the investigation stopped being strategic for me. It became personal, in a way I could no longer set aside. I spent the following weeks building what I needed. Quiet meetings with Elliot after hours, going through trust documentation to confirm exactly what authority I held and precisely how and when I could exercise it. A careful, gentle conversation with Priya, giving her enough truth to keep her safe without putting her at risk. A visit to Walter, who confirmed something I hadn't expected, that the trust's activation clause, the one requiring me to reach a certain point of readiness before assuming control, had a secondary trigger my father had built in specifically. Any attempt to sell a subsidiary below independently verified market value, without full board and trust beneficiary disclosure, would automatically void the board's authority to proceed, and would trigger my right to assume direct voting control of the company immediately, regardless of the original timeline. My father hadn't just protected the company from a bad decision. He'd built a trap, 6 years in advance, for exactly this scenario. I don't know if he suspected Gavin or Diane or anyone specific. I think he simply understood, better than anyone, how these things happen and made sure that whoever tried it would walk directly into a door only I could open. I told Elliot I wanted to let the board presentation happen. I wanted Gavin and Diane to walk all the way to the edge of it, fully confident, fully exposed, before I made a single move. That's a risk, Elliot said. If they push through the vote before you're ready to assert your authority formally, it becomes much harder to unwind afterward. I know, I said. But if I move too early, all anyone will ever say is that Daniel Ashford's daughter panicked and shut down a legitimate deal before it was fully proven. I need them to commit. Publicly. In front of everyone. What I didn't tell Elliot that week, what I could barely admit to myself, was that some part of me also needed to see exactly how far Gavin was willing to go. Not for the company. For me. I found out faster than I expected. 3 days before the scheduled board presentation, Gavin scheduled the executive strategy meeting where he would fire me in front of everyone. I never saw the actual planning document. I didn't need to. Priya overheard Diane's assistant mention it in passing and warned me the same afternoon. He's going to do it in front of the board observers, she told me, her voice tight with anger on my behalf. He's going to make an example of you before the Holbrook vote, so nobody questions the numbers you'd already started raising. Nora, you need to fight this. Go to HR. Go to legal. Something. I thought about it for exactly one night. Then I called Elliot and told him it was time to prepare the documentation. All of it. The trust certification. The formal notice of beneficiary status. The legal filing that would, the instant I chose to submit it, transform Nora Bennett, mid-level strategy associate, into Nora Ashford, majority controlling owner of Ashford Meridian Group. You're going to let him fire you first, Elliot said slowly, understanding. I need him to believe he's won, I said. Completely. Publicly. In front of the board. In front of everyone who's ever watched him take credit for my work and said nothing. I need every person in that room to see exactly who he is before they see who I am. There was a long pause on the line. Nora, Elliot said finally, once you walk into that room and let him do this, there's no version of what happens next that's quiet. You understand that? I'm counting on it, I said. 2 days later, I sat down at the conference table for what everyone else in the room believed was an ordinary Tuesday strategy review, opened my notebook, uncapped my pen, and waited for Gavin Whitmore to say the words that would end my career. He had no idea he was about to hand me the exact company he thought he was taking from me. I walked out of that building the same way I'd walked in every morning for 3 years, through the revolving glass doors, past the security desk where Marcus Bell used to make me laugh with terrible jokes before I knew what he really was, out onto the sidewalk where the November wind hit my face and, for one honest second, I let myself feel every bit of what had just happened. Humiliated. That's the word for it, and I won't pretend otherwise. 14 people had watched a man I'd once respected dismantle 3 years of my work in under 2 minutes, and not one of them had said a single word in my defense. Priya had wanted to. I'd seen it in her face, the way her hand had gripped the edge of the table. But I'd told her, days earlier, in the quietest voice I had, whatever happens in that meeting, say nothing. Let it happen exactly the way he wants it to happen. I got 2 blocks before I had to stop and lean against a building because my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and it wasn't triumph. It was 3 years of swallowed anger finally finding a door out of my body. I let it happen for about 90 seconds. Then I straightened my coat, called Elliot Voss, and said 4 words. It's done. File it. Inside the building I'd just left, Gavin Whitmore was, by all accounts, having a very good afternoon. I heard about most of what happened next secondhand, from Priya, mostly, in careful, furious detail, and later from other people who had less reason to be careful. But the shape of it was consistent enough that I trust it. Gavin held an impromptu celebration in his office that evening. Not officially, of course, nothing so obvious. But he ordered in a bottle of the good scotch he kept in his credenza for closing big deals, and he invited Diane Foster in for what he clearly considered a private victory lap. One less variable, he reportedly told her, raising a glass. She was getting too curious about things that weren't her business. Diane, from what I understand, was more measured. She'd always been the more careful of the two of them, and careful people rarely celebrate before the paperwork is signed. "Let's make sure the Holbrook vote goes smoothly first," she said. "Then we celebrate." He told a version of the story to anyone who'd listen over the following days. That I'd been underperforming for months. That the Q3 error had been mine, not caught by me. That he'd given me every chance and I'd simply failed to meet the standard. Some people believed him, because believing the person with power is usually the safer choice. Others, Priya told me this mattered more to her than almost anything else in that whole ordeal, started quietly asking questions instead. Why had someone who'd built the Holbrook renegotiation from scratch been let go days before its biggest deal in years reached the board? Marcus Bell, interestingly, said almost nothing at all. Priya said he looked genuinely uncomfortable in the days after, the kind of quiet that comes from someone realizing they've helped build something they can no longer control the size of. I wasn't in that building to see any of it. I was in Elliot Voss's law office 2 miles away, sitting across from him and Walter Higgins, signing documents that had been sitting ready for months, waiting only for this exact moment. "Once this is filed," Elliot said, sliding the last page toward me, "there's no undoing it. The board will receive formal notice 48 hours before the scheduled Holbrook vote. You'll be required to appear." I picked up the pen. My hand had finally stopped shaking. "Good," I said. "I want them to have exactly 48 hours to feel confident about a vote that's already lost." The 2 days that followed were the strangest of my life. I wasn't an employee anymore. I wasn't yet, publicly, anything else. I existed in a kind of quiet in-between, working from Elliot's office, going through 6 years of trust documentation, financial statements, and board minutes I'd never had proper access to before, trying to understand the full shape of what my father had actually built and what had been slowly taken from it since he died. That was when I found the detail that changed everything about what I thought I understood. Buried in 5-year-old board minutes, in a meeting held only 3 weeks before my father's death, was a motion proposed by Diane Foster, seconded by a board member who'd since retired, to authorize an independent valuation review of Colby Renewables. My father had voted against it. The motion failed, 4-3. 2 weeks later, he was dead. 3 months after that, with a new, more compliant board member appointed in the resulting reshuffle, an almost identical motion passed without objection. I sat with that for a long time. I called Walter that night. He was quiet for a long moment after I read him the dates. "Your father called me the week before he died," Walter said finally, and I heard something in his voice I'd never heard before: grief, still raw after 6 years, and something close to guilt. He said Diane had been pushing hard for a valuation review he didn't trust. He said he thought someone wanted Colby cheap enough to move it off the books entirely, and he was trying to figure out who benefited if that happened. I told him to be careful. I never asked careful of what. 2 weeks later, he had a heart attack in his own office at 59, with no prior heart condition anyone knew about. He paused. "I've never had proof of anything more than that, Nora. I want to be honest with you. I don't know that anyone did anything to your father. I only know the timing has bothered me for 6 years, and I never had the standing to push harder." I didn't say anything for a while. "You have standing now," I finally said. "So do I. I want to be honest about something here, the way Walter was honest with me. I never found definitive proof that Diane Foster or anyone else caused my father's death. I want to be careful not to hand you, or myself, a version of this story that's cleaner and more satisfying than the truth actually allows. What I found was a pattern of financial manipulation that began while he was alive, that he was actively investigating when he died, and that accelerated significantly once he was gone. What that timing means, I'll let you draw your own conclusions about. I've drawn mine. But it's not the same thing as proof, and I never let myself forget the difference, even when it would have been easier to. What I did have proof of: real, documented, legally binding proof, was enough to end the Holbrook sale and enough to make Gavin Whitmore's victory lap the shortest one of his career. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning, in the same room where I'd once sat as Nora Bennett, taking notes in a chair nobody thought twice about. I arrived at 9:52, in a navy suit I'd bought specifically for this, Elliot Voss on one side of me and Walter Higgins on the other, both of them dressed for what all three of us understood was a kind of formal warfare, conducted entirely through paperwork and procedure. Gavin was already inside, standing near the head of the table, in the middle of some final confident word with Diane Foster. He saw me through the glass wall before I opened the door, and I watched his face do something complicated, confusion first, because I wasn't supposed to be there at all, then something closer to alarm as he registered who was walking beside me. I opened the door myself. "Good morning," I said, and I let the room feel exactly how strange it was for a woman they'd fired 11 days earlier to walk in flanked by the company's general counsel and a former chief operating officer, and take a seat not at the visitor's end of the table, but at the head of it. "I'm sorry," Gavin said, recovering fast, the way people like him always do. "This is a closed board session." "I'm not sure why." "Elliot," I said, "would you like to make the introduction, or should I?" Elliot stood, opened a leather folder, and began reading from a document that had been notarized, filed, and legally certified 2 days earlier. The formal certification of trust, transferring full and immediate voting control of 61% of Ashford Meridian Group's shares to its sole beneficiary. My legal name, read aloud, slowly, into a silence so complete I could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. "Nora Elizabeth Ashford," Elliot said, "daughter of the company's founder, Daniel Ashford, and, as of this filing, majority controlling shareholder of Ashford Meridian Group." I watched the exact moment it landed on Gavin's face. Not confusion anymore. Not alarm. Something closer to the ground falling away beneath him, the particular look of a man realizing, in real time, that every assumption he'd built his last 3 years on had just been proven false, all at once, in front of the one audience he could never talk his way past. "That's not," he started and stopped, because there was genuinely nothing to say yet. He hadn't had time to construct a lie good enough for this. Diane Foster said nothing at all. I noticed that immediately, and I filed it away. "I believe," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, "we're here today to vote on the sale of Colby Renewables to Holbrook Industrial. I'd like to formally request the floor before that vote proceeds." The board chair, a woman named Sandra Whitcomb, who I'd only ever seen from a distance, looked at Elliot for confirmation, then nodded slowly. "The floor is yours, Ms. Ashford." I laid it out carefully, the way I'd rehearsed 100 times in my head over the previous 48 hours, but never out loud, never in front of the people it was actually meant for. I walked the board through the valuation discrepancy, year by year, showing exactly how Colby Renewables had been quietly devalued on paper by nearly 40% over 4 years, through a series of adjustments that individually looked reasonable and collectively told a very different story. I showed the routing history of the Holbrook term sheet and the timeline that placed its earliest draft only weeks after I'd first started asking questions about Colby's true worth in strategy meetings. I laid out, without editorializing, the performance improvement plan Gavin had drafted for me 8 weeks before I'd ever mentioned Colby Renewables at all. "I want to be precise about what I'm alleging and what I'm not," I said. "I'm not alleging today that anyone in this room committed a crime. I'm alleging that this company's own subsidiary was deliberately undervalued, that a sale was structured to exploit that undervaluation, and that an employee who began asking legitimate questions about it was terminated on fabricated performance grounds within days of a scheduled board vote. I have the documentation for all 3 claims. I'd like the board to review it before proceeding with any vote today." Gavin found his voice first, which didn't surprise me. "This is absurd," he said, standing now, color rising in his face. You were an employee. A strategy associate. You expect this board to believe some kind of elaborate conspiracy based on documents, Gavin, I said quietly. Not based on anything I'm asking anyone to simply believe. You lied to everyone, he said, and there was real anger in it now, not performance anymore. You sat in this company for 3 years pretending to be someone you weren't. I used my mother's name, I said. I never lied about a single number, a single deadline, a single piece of work I actually did. You, on the other hand, presented my market entry model to this board as your own 11 months ago. Would you like me to pull the email chain where I sent you the finished analysis 40 minutes before your presentation? The room was silent. Sandra Whitcomb's expression had gone very still, the particular stillness of someone recalculating everything they thought they knew about a person they'd trusted. I think, she said slowly, we're going to table the Holbrook vote indefinitely, pending a full independent audit of the Colby valuation history. And I think, Mr. Whitmore, you should consider carefully what you say in this room for the rest of this meeting. Gavin sat back down. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely uncertain what to do with his hands. I want to tell you the story ended there, cleanly, with Gavin exposed and Diane silent and everyone finally understanding the truth. It didn't. Because underneath the relief of that moment was a question I still hadn't answered, one that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the night Elliot showed me that term sheet. Gavin had reacted with genuine shock in that room. Real, unrehearsed shock. The kind you can't fake convincingly in front of a board of people trained to read exactly that. Which meant something I'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to fully accept. Gavin Whitmore hadn't known who I was, and more than that, he hadn't fully understood what he was actually part of. Diane Foster had barely spoken. 2 days after that board meeting, once the independent audit had been formally authorized and the company's outside counsel had begun reviewing every valuation adjustment for the past 6 years, Elliot came to my temporary office, Walter's old office, technically, which I'd started using while everyone figured out what my actual title should be with a look on his face I hadn't seen from him before. The auditors found something, he said, sitting down across from me without waiting to be asked. The Colby undervaluation wasn't Gavin's plan. It goes back further than his involvement, further than the Holbrook deal. There's a shell entity, registered 8 years ago, that's received consulting fees from Ashford Meridian totaling almost $11 million over that time, for work nobody in operations can identify or verify. The entity is owned, through 2 intermediary holding companies, by Diane Foster. I felt something cold settle in my chest. 8 years, I repeated. That's before my father died. That's before your father died, Elliot confirmed. Nora, I think Gavin was a tool in this, not the architect. I think Diane built this slowly, over the better part of a decade, and I think Gavin genuinely believed he was executing a legitimate corporate strategy, a merger that would make him look brilliant, position him for the CEO role once the board eventually retired Sandra Whitcomb. I don't think he ever knew about the shell company. I don't think he knew what Diane was actually doing underneath the deal he thought he was running. And my father, I said slowly. The valuation review he voted against. The one that passed after he died. Elliot was quiet for a moment. I think you already know what I'm going to say. I can't prove causation. I can prove Diane had 8 years of financial motive, and I can prove she moved the moment your father was no longer in a position to stop her. That's what I can put in front of a court. What actually happened in the weeks before he died, I don't know if we'll ever have proof of that. I'm sorry. I sat with that for a long time after Elliot left. Gavin Whitmore had humiliated me in front of 14 people, believing he was protecting his own ambition. But underneath him, quietly, for 8 years, someone had been dismantling my father's company one careful adjustment at a time, and might have been the reason I grew up without him for the last 6 of those years. I understood, finally, that removing Gavin had never been the real fight. He was the visible piece. Diane Foster was the structure underneath it, and structures like that don't collapse because one person gets fired in a conference room. They collapse when someone with the authority to look underneath the floor finally does. I called an emergency shareholder meeting 9 days later. Diane Foster was placed on administrative leave the morning of the audit's preliminary findings and did not attend. I've since learned she resigned formally 2 weeks after that, through her attorney, before the company's outside counsel could complete a termination process that would have ended considerably worse for her. The matter was referred to the Securities and Exchange Commission and, separately, to the Cook County District Attorney's Office for review of the shell company payments. I understand those proceedings are still ongoing. I don't know yet how they'll resolve, and I've made peace, mostly, with not knowing. Gavin's situation resolved faster and less mercifully than I expected to feel about it. He came to my office 3 days after the board meeting, my actual office now, the one that used to belong to a chief strategy officer whose position had, in the restructuring, effectively become mine to fill or eliminate. He looked smaller than I remembered him looking, which I think surprised both of us. I didn't know, he said, before I'd even invited him to sit. About Diane. About any of it. I thought I was building something. I thought the Holbrook deal was going to be the thing that finally proved I belonged at the top of this company. I believe you, I said, and I meant it, which seemed to surprise him more than anything else I could have said. I don't think you knew about the shell company. I think that makes what you did to me worse in one way and better in another. Worse how? Because you didn't need Diane's help to steal my work for 3 years. You did that entirely on your own, because it was easy, and because you assumed I'd never have the power to make it matter. I let that sit for a second. Better, because at least I understand now that firing me wasn't part of some grand conspiracy against my father's legacy. It was just you, protecting your own ambition, the same way you always have. That's smaller. It's also, somehow, more honest. He didn't have a response to that. I let the silence stretch longer than was comfortable for either of us. What happens to me? He finally asked. You're terminated, effective today, for cause misappropriation of employee work product and falsification of performance documentation, both of which the audit trail supports independently of anything Diane did. I'm not going to pursue anything beyond that. I considered it. I decided it wasn't the company I want to run. I paused. You built a career out of taking credit for other people's work, Gavin. I'd think about what you actually know how to do on your own, before you walk into your next interview. He left without saying anything else. I heard, months later, secondhand, that he'd taken a director-level position at a much smaller firm, a significant step down, and that the story of how he lost his last job had, unsurprisingly, followed him there in fragments, told by people who'd watched the whole thing unfold. Marcus Bell resigned before I ever had to decide what to do about him. I don't know if that was guilt or self-preservation. Possibly both. Priya told me, months later, that he'd sent her a message apologizing for things he wasn't proud of, without ever specifying exactly what those things were. I never heard from him directly, and I never reached out. Some bridges you let stay burned, not out of cruelty, but because rebuilding them would cost more than they're worth. Priya became my chief of staff 4 months later, a title we more or less invented for her because I genuinely didn't know how to run a company of this size without someone I trusted completely sitting close enough to catch what I missed. Walter agreed to return to the board as chairman emeritus, a role that mostly involves him telling me stories about my father over lunch twice a month, which has turned out to matter more to me than almost anything in the official restructuring. Elliot stayed on as general counsel, and somewhere in the 8 months since that board meeting, the guarded distance he'd always kept turned into something closer to real friendship, forged the way I suppose most real friendships in that building were forged under pressure, with something enormous on the line. Sandra Whitcomb stepped down as board chair 6 months after the audit concluded, not in disgrace, but with what struck me as genuine relief. I should have asked harder questions a long time ago, she told me at her final board meeting. I let Diane's numbers go unchallenged because she was good at making complicated things sound simple. That's on me, not just her. I didn't disagree with her, But I also told her I understood exactly how that happens, because I'd watched 14 people do the same thing in a conference room, myself included, for far too long, before I finally had the standing to do something about it. I think about that conference room often, still. Not with the anger I expected to carry, and not quite with the clean, satisfying triumph the version of this story in my head used to imagine, either. What I feel mostly when I think about the day Gavin Whitmore fired me in front of everyone I worked with is something closer to clarity. He believed, in that moment, that he was removing the last obstacle between himself and everything he wanted. He had no idea he was handing me exactly what I needed: a room full of witnesses, a documented act of bad faith, and the final piece of proof that the company my father built needed someone willing to walk back into it as no one at all. Just to find out who it really belonged to, underneath all the people who assumed they already knew. He thought firing me was the end of my story at Ashford Meridian. It was the moment his own arrogance finally introduced him to mine.